So the next framing question we need to deal with is this one. How do seeds and pollen allow seed plants to populate diverse ecosystems? But before we get too involved with that, I think there might be a question.
Yeah, so I was having trouble understanding what Gametophyte and Sporophyte is.
Okay, this whole idea, this whole concept of alternation of generations. So let's talk about this for a little bit because it's actually going to come up in this slide, and I want to show you what this looks like and how it actually works. Okay, so we've got, I'm going to put 3 different groups here. We're going to do green algae, we're going to do bryophytes, and we're going to do tracheophytes. Tracheophytes. Can you even see this orange back there?
Yeah, we're all good.
You're all good? What about on that side? Okay. It's not a great color. When we're doing our lecture break, I'll go get a black marker and I will write over all of the orange and get us all on the same page. Okay, so green algae, the way their life cycle works is that they are typically haploid, meaning that they have one copy of the genome. We call that 1N. And then when they reproduce sexually, I'm running out of space. So this arrow is sexual reproduction. Okay, sexual reproduction. For a moment, they are 2N. For a moment, and then they undergo meiosis and restore the haploid condition. Okay, that's typical for green algae. Okay, and so some would argue that this is exactly the alternation of generations that you find in plants because they have a haploid stage where they have one copy of the genome, and they have a diploid stage where they have 2 copies of the genome. But really, this is very short-lived. It's the 2 cells fused together, you get a 2N cell, and then immediately they go through meiosis and regenerate that haploid condition. Okay? Bryophytes, now you start to get true alternation of generations, where you have a major haploid life stage, you have a major diploid, I don't know why I capitalized that one. You actually have 2 significant stages where they have what you would recognize as a plant or plant tissue that can sometimes be haploid and sometimes be diploid. They both are true. They actually have significant portions of their life history where every cell in the tissue has 2 entire copies of the genome. Okay?
This is both those?
Yeah, so bryophytes, let's make this, remember I'll go back and I'll cover this with a black marker, but I have to go grab one. So if you're having a hard time seeing the orange. I don't know why they make orange expo markers. It's not a great color. I mean, it's a great color, but not for expo markers. Okay, so we actually have 2 significant stages. There's a meaningful stage that's diploid, but since it's a bryophyte, this is the dominant stage. And then to go from here to here, you have your gametes fuse. So here's where you add your sexual reproduction to go from the haploid stage to the diploid stage. And then to go from here to here, you have meiosis. But notice, this is a very, very short-lived. I mean, this exists almost just intermittently. Almost as like a single cell that has 2 copies of the genome and then immediately go through meiosis. But here we actually have a significant portion of the life history where it lives, where every cell in the tissue has 2 copies of the genome. And this right here, I'll put a little star here. This is where the embryo is. So we have a group that refers to all plants called Bryophyta, right? Or the Bryophytes. Do you remember that from the table? Okay, and this right here is the embryo, the beginning of this diploid stage, and then it grows into an actual mature form of the diploid life history. Okay, so Bryophytes, you have the dominant stage is the haploid. Tracheophytes, all other plants, they still have this haploid stage and diploid stage. But now this is the dominant stage. The embryo is still here at the beginning of this diploid stage. You still go from haploid to diploid by gametes fusing. And you still go from diploid to haploid by meiosis. But the difference between plants and algae, at least green algae, is that this diploid phase is pretty significant. It is a multicellular organism that is diploid, 2 copies of the genome in every cell. In your most green algae species, this diploid is just a single cell that forms and then immediately goes through meiosis. Okay? So this is a little bit of information on the alternation of generations. The thing about plants and brown algae are this way as well. They actually have a significant multicellular form that's haploid, having 1 copy of the genome, and a significant multicellular form that is diploid, where every cell has 2 copies of the genome. Okay? That's unique when compared to green algae. Green algae, they have a diploid stage, but it tends to be a single cell that immediately goes through meiosis. Okay? Does that make more sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
You bet. So the Bryophytes, these are just mosses, liverworts, hornworts. Every other type of plant, the dominant stage, the one where it spends the most significant portion of its life history, what you would tend to recognize as that plant is as the diploid stage, which is the sporophyte. So another way is this is gametophyte, this is sporophyte. Gametophyte, sporophyte. Okay? Haploid stage, diploid stage, gametophyte, sporophyte. Okay? Any better? Hopefully it's not worse, because that's really bad. It's like, here, let me help you understand this, and then you leave and you're like, I thought I understood it before, and now I want to throw up. Yeah, Chloe.
Why is haploid like circled and...
For this one, because that's the dominant stage.
Okay, and
Yeah.
diploid's the dominant.
Yep. And what I mean by the dominant is the most significant portion of its life is spent in that stage. Yeah, Levi.
So, when we're talking about this, we also tend to talk about sporophyte and gametophyte.
Yes.
Where does that fit in?
Yeah. So haploid is the gametophyte, diploid is the sporophyte.
Okay.
And you can tell that even from right here, the gametes. Gametes are made by the gametophyte. That's why it's called the gametophyte. The gametophyte makes gametes. All right? Yeah, Aiden.
So you said haploid was the gametophyte?
Gametophyte, yes.
Okay, got it.
Yep. I did say that.
So gametophytes?
Yes, are haploid. Yep. Yes. All right. Now let's address this question. How do seeds and pollen, these are features unique to seed plants, right? Which makes sense. Why would we call a plant seedless if it has seeds? We wouldn't do it, right? You wouldn't do it. Sorry. So you have to remember that seedless plants, they require water in order to reproduce. The sperm have to travel from the antheridium to the archegonium by swimming. That's true of all seedless plants. It's true of moss, it's true of liverworts, it's true of hornworts, it's true of ferns and club mosses and whisk ferns and all those other weird, seedless vascular plants. So in these seedless plants, the sperm are flagellated so that they can propel themselves through water to swim from the antheridium to the archegonium. Now, something you also have to remember is where these gametes fuse, they form the zygote. That's true of all living organisms. When two gametes fuse, you form what's called the zygote. That this actually develops inside of this haploid stage. It develops inside of the gametophyte. And this is something that you'll have to remember from lab because we didn't actually talk about it in lecture. So these features really tie seedless plants, especially those that are non-vascular, but even the vascular seedless plants like ferns and club mosses, to moist environments. Because they need water just to get the male gamete to the female gamete. Can't make it happen without water. Now let's start talking about how these features actually enable seed plants to populate diverse ecosystems. So now enter features that you find in seed plants that you don't find in seedless plants. First one, pollen grains. These are the male gametophytes, haploid or diploid? Haploid. Male gametophytes are these pollen grains, and they, rather than swimming through water, although the entire male gametophyte doesn't swim through the water, just the male gamete, but in this case the entire gametophyte travels to where the female gamete is, protecting the male gametes, keeping them moist and safe, and I don't know, what more do you need than that, right? Keeping them moist and safe. I was going to give you a third, but I couldn't think of something. Warm, safe, warm, and moist. The entire gametophyte travels over to where the female gametes are, either carried there by the wind, or water will still work. Doesn't need it, but water will still work. Or animals can do that as well. And then now, once your male gamete can fuse with the female gamete and you form the zygote inside of the female gametophyte, you start to produce your next stage, your diploid stage. Your zygote is your embryo, develops into this diploid sporophyte, and it's packaged inside of something else that's going to keep that moist, safe, and warm. Okay? So the pollen keeps the male gametes safe, moist, and warm, and then the seeds keep the developing embryo, the juvenile sporophyte, try the same order. Safe, moist, and warm. I don't think that was the same order. And so now you find two structures in seed plants that function basically entirely to facilitate reproduction away from water by keeping very critical components safe, moist, and warm. All right? Make sense? This is something that your seedless plants don't have. So the only way they're going to stay safe, moist, and warm is if they are inside of water. Yeah, Emily.
So you said, so the male gametophytes are the haploid stage. But
Yes.
Isn't the haploid stage the female stage?
But you have male and female haploid stage. So you have a male gametophyte and you have a female gametophyte, both of which are haploid. And then so the male haploid makes male gametes, sperm. The female gametophyte, or the female haploid stage, makes female gametes, eggs.
And then the sporophyte makes diploid.
It's diploid, because after the sperm fertilizes an egg, now you have two copies of the genome. One that came from the sperm, one that came from the egg. You've got two copies of the genome now. You no longer have a gamete, you have a zygote, and that's the plant embryo. Just like in animals, that zygote is the animal embryo. But notice we call these embryophytes, indicating that they have something green algae do not. And what is that something? The embryo, what the very name comes from. This juvenile sporophyte, this juvenile diploid stage, and you're like, wait, they've got a diploid stage. Yeah, but it's just a single cell. It very rarely ever goes through and develops a multicellular structure. Yeah, Allison.
So in the seed plant, is the pistil, entire pistil the female gametophyte, or is it just contained?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the pistil contains the female gametophyte, but is also made by it. So it's hard to know. It's hard to know where to delineate that. We'll have another conundrum like that as well when we get to placental mammals, and you're like, is the placenta the embryo or the mother? And the answer is yes. Yeah. So I'll answer it. It's the answer to your question is yes. It is both the female gametophyte and contains the female gametophyte. Yeah. But then the anthers and the stamen, right? Those just contain the male gametophytes, which are the pollen. Although some would argue that the entire thing is the male gametophyte and the pollen is just part of it. It's not always easy to know where that distinction needs to be made. All right, lecture break time. Okay. So what I want you to do is take a couple of minutes, talk about this question here. How can we explain seed plants, which are just some of our tracheophytes, evolving from seedless plants, and are there any evidences of this? Okay? So this, you probably have already started to address this because you've already submitted your homework assignment, because it's Wednesday, it's Homework Wednesday. Or if you haven't, you're gearing up for submitting Homework Wednesday, right? Yeah, I know the homework just focused on the question like, do angiosperms come from gymnosperms? But in preparation for that, you've looked at all seed plants and have started. So you're basically just answering this question here. It's written on the board for you. Okay, 2 minutes. 2 minutes, starting now.
What do you got? That's a good question. What about you? Where would you think Let's do what we do best. Wait, we always be quick to load. That was what was it? James 1. Yeah. I know it's on like the right-hand Bible. I've read it so much, like I can just see it. I mean, I was the right side and left one. Yeah, right side.
All right. So what are some thoughts? Let's deal with this first part of this question first. How could you evolve seed plants from seedless plants? Levi.
I think that the seed allows the plant to reproduce in absence of water.
Absolutely, and allows the embryo to develop apart from water. And what we'll find in a little bit actually even allows that embryo to be sustained for long periods of time when the environment may be even too harsh for a seed plant. And so it'll stay inside the seed for a long period of time and wait that out until conditions are better. That is true. Yeah.
So it gives it more
Well, absolutely. So if you somehow were capable of making seeds, those individuals that can make seeds would be wildly successful in environments that are more isolated from water, especially compared to individuals that couldn't make seeds, right? So there's no doubt that the ability to make seeds would be favored by natural selection in environments that are isolated from water. No doubt about that. Yeah, Amanda.
I think structurally, like the liverworts, like because they have like that cup that the sexual reproduction occurs in, it's possible that the seed structure evolves from that.
Okay.
Because I feel like that cup is with like some form of protection or motor.
Well, so there's no doubt that in all plants the sporophyte develops inside the female gametophyte. That's true. That's seemingly true for all plants. That the sporophyte, the embryo, develops inside of the female gametophyte, meaning you already have tissue in place that could be modified into the seed, right? You already have tissue in place from the female gametophyte where the embryo is developing inside that could be modified into a seed, and that is absolutely something that would need to happen in order to evolve seed plants from seedless plants. Right? There's already tissue in place, it needs to be modified such to develop into a seed. Okay, so that's one thing that would need to happen. Any other ideas, thoughts, things you want to share? Emerson, you look like you want to say something.
Thinker.
You're a thinker? That's only one of the new structures. What is an additional new structure in seed plants? Pollen, right? We've got an additional new structure. Now notice, I said notice, but I went to the next slide. The pollen, where is it? Right here. It's the entire male gametophyte, meaning you already have tissue in place, right? In all plants, you have a male gametophyte and an actual real portion of the life history that generates male gametes. So you already have tissue in place that needs to be modified into a pollen grain. But you already have a male gametophyte in all plants. So in order to evolve seed plants from seedless plants, the male gametophyte structure needs to change such that it can prevent water loss. And same thing with seeds. That the female gametophyte structure needs to change such that it can prevent water loss. So we've got a theme here, right? To develop seeds, the female gametophyte needs to change to prevent water loss. To produce pollen, the male gametophyte needs to change to reduce water loss, okay? But you have tissue in place, it needs to be chemically modified, right? You don't necessarily need to make a structure that doesn't exist, you need to modify an already existing structure. Okay? So it's a little bit different than developing, say, like a waxy cuticle for a green algae to move on to land. Okay? A green alga, sorry, algae is plural. A green alga to move on land. Okay? That's a little bit different because now we're not just modifying an already existing structure, we're building something new. Right? This is modifying an already existing structure. Does it seem less challenging? Modifying an already existing structure than building something new? As it depends on what the task is, right? Sometimes it's easier to bulldoze a house and build a new one than it is to modify. Anyways, but it seems more doable. Okay, seems more doable. Now the next part of the question, is there evidence of this? Did you want to say something, David?
Yeah. So the male and female gametophytes would just need to change.
They need to be modified, right? The male gametophyte needs to be modified into a pollen grain. The female gametophyte needs to be modified into a seed. And we'll actually see how that happens. It's actually wonderful how you make seeds.
Okay.
It's really wonderful. And then in Angiosperms, there's an additional portion of the female gametophyte that develops into the fruit, the endosperm. It's wonderful. Okay, second part of the question, are there any evidences of this? Yeah, Allison.
Well, it seems like from green algae to bryophytes to tracheophytes, the diploid stage becomes more and more prominent with each successive
Absolutely.
level.
Mhm.
Yes, I don't know if that's
Sure.
evidence or not.
Yeah, so you could say like telling a story of how a plant becomes more sophisticated is supported by the existence of plants at every stage along that way, right? So if all you were given was a green alga and a fruiting plant, like an apple tree, no, let's do an avocado tree because they're way better. Okay? So all you were given was a green alga and you were given an avocado tree, and you were to think of what are the steps that I would have to go through in order to get from this, the green algal species, to this, the avocado tree. You will find plants that exist at almost every single one of those steps that would have to happen along the way. Right? You could absolutely use that as support. This is a little bit different than what we'll see when we get to animals, right? Because when you get to animals and you're like, if I want to go from this thing, a choanoflagellate, which you probably don't know what that is yet, but you will, to a human, and you go through everything that I would need to happen along the way, and we have virtually no living organisms that represent any of those stages. Okay, but with plants, it's a different story. We have basically a living plant that would represent every major monumental step along that process. Okay, any other evidence? Some of which we've already talked about, but I mean, you may have forgotten. But I'd like to think you don't, because you understand the importance of what we've been talking about, and you store it in the Holy of Holies, right? The fossil record of plants is all of these plants that are basically stepping stones of increasing complexity. They all appear later in the fossil record. Bryophytes, that first step from green algae to avocado trees, are the first plants that show up in the fossil record. And then your seedless vascular plants, like ferns, are the next plants to show up in the fossil record. And then your gymnosperms, which are seed plants, but they don't make fruit. They have naked seeds. Okay, they show up next in the fossil record. And then finally, we get our angiosperms. Our fruit-bearing plants show up in the fossil record. They show up in the right order. Right? It's so intriguing. It's so intriguing. And so, are there any issues with this? We'll talk about that on Friday. Okay? But right now we just talked about how could this happen? Is there evidence that it did happen? We have an idea of how it happened, and you would have to say, yes, there is evidence that it happened. But on Friday, we'll deal with the alternative. Is there an alternative explanation for this? Here's some different images of pollen grains, male gametophytes from plants long gone, right? Little remnants. And in a lot of plants that no longer exist, the only thing we have from those plants is their pollen. The male gametophyte, that's the only thing we know about the entire plant. We don't know what the female gametophyte looks like. We don't know what the sporophyte looks like. But we know what the male gametophyte looks like. Because pollen is it's very good at doing its job. And what is pollen's job? I said this like 17 times. It was really obnoxious. Yeah, Tara. Yeah, keep the sperm safe, moist, and warm. Right? It's so good at doing that job that if you bury it with a bunch of sediment, and over time that sediment hardens into rock, it's still keeping the sperm safe, not moist any longer. That's long gone. And probably not warm either, because rock gets pretty cold underground. but it's still safe. Although it's been mineralized, so now it's actually rock or sperm-shaped rock. But we still can see it, what it used to look like. Does its job so wonderfully well. And then here, some different illustrations of what these male gametophytes and female gametophytes are packaged in. These in many of our gymnosperms that bear cones. And then here you've got pollen, and here's your pollen grain, your male gametophyte. Look at this. You saw this in lab, right? The pollen tube forming from your male gametophyte, right? That was one of the things you had to sketch. The tube, and then something else. And man, it's so wonderful. And then from there, you fertilize the ova made inside the female gametophyte, and then that female gametophyte converts itself into the seed to keep the embryo what? Safe, moist, and warm. Even in the midst of really, really cold places, because a lot of these gymnosperms, a lot of our cone-bearing trees are very well adapted to high elevation, really cold places where angiosperms struggle. There are some angiosperms that really like the cold, but avocado trees are not one of them, which is unfortunate because it makes it really hard to grow them in these higher elevation areas where our temperatures get down close to freezing. Wouldn't it be wonderful just to have a massive avocado tree in your backyard that you could just go and, and if it would fruit all year round, right? It's just like, you know what? It's middle of December. I want an avocado from my backyard and not from somewhere across the world that by the time it gets to me and it's soft, it's already rotten.
My grandparents used to have 4 avocado trees, and they were able to harvest the avocados from them.
Yeah. That makes me sad. Not for your grandparents, but for the rest of us. Anyways, all right, so the next one. Question number 3. How would you distinguish between a cycad and a palm tree? Man, this is a great question. And by a great question, I mean, this is a really great question. Like, if you were to just, picture some hypothetical assessment that will happen after Engage, and you were to see this question on it, you would be like, man, this really is a really great question. Because the question isn't what it seems. The question is sort of asking, how would you distinguish between a cycad and a palm tree? But what it's really asking is, how do you tell the difference between a gymnosperm and an angiosperm, which are 2 different types of seed plants? That's why this is such a nice question, because it's not even really asking you what you think it's asking you. That's a hint. I don't know if I can give you any more of a hint. Here's what I don't know what happened. So I don't know how many times I said, like, hey, these lecture break questions, these are really good questions. And then I cannot count on both hands and both feet the number of people that did really poorly on the lecture break questions that appeared word for word on the exam. So I want to tell you, this is a really great question. And I would like for that not to be the same reality. Just putting that out there. So how do you distinguish between a cycad and a palm tree? It's really asking us, how do you distinguish between a gymnosperm and an angiosperm? Is what this question is really getting at. And look at the slide answers it right away. Look at that. This, not only is it a great question, but it's actually a really well-constructed slide. You're welcome for that. Modern gymnosperms do not bear fruit or flowers. Instead, they produce naked seeds as opposed to angiosperms. So that means angiosperms produce fruit or flowers and produce coated seeds that are not naked. Yeah, Mia.
Why is it specifically modern gymnosperms?
Oh, well, so there are some gymnosperms that we only know from their pollen. And it's just like, well, we don't know. I mean, maybe this is very clearly gymnosperm pollen, but maybe it did produce, coated seeds or fruits and flowers. Yeah, Chris.
So you're saying the palm tree is specifically a gymnosperm, then?
The palm tree is an angiosperm. The cycad is a gymnosperm. Yeah. All right, so gymnosperms are organized into 4 phyla. The first one, these are all fun to say, Coniferaophyta. Coniferaophyta. What do you think of when you see this word? Phyta, we already know, means phylum of plants, right? That's kind of been the norm. Yes, a conifer. It's a cone-bearing plant. So Coniferaophyta. Usually tall trees, although not always. There are some small conifers. Needle-like leaves that reduce water loss. Really well adapted for cold weather. Arid, dry, cold places. Like high elevations. I don't know if you knew this or not, but high elevation areas tend to not get very much moisture because for a cloud to get all the way up there, it's got to lighten. And in order to lighten, it's got to drop its moisture. So you tend to, like, the wettest places are at certain latitudes and like right at the base of a mountain that the clouds have to move up because then they have to drop all their water to get up there. Yeah.
So it's like, when you, if you were to go hiking up Mount Everest, like you first have to pass through this dense jungle.
Yes.
Before you reach the mountain.
Yes. But the nice thing about a mountain is even if the top of it gets very little moisture, all of that moisture falls down to lower parts of the mountain, right? So the middle part of the mountain, you get what rainfall you get, plus what little rainfall what above you gets is going to wash down through you as well. Yeah.
So otherwise they're like constantly snow on top of the mountain. Which
Is there? It depends on the height of the mountain, and sometimes it's just permanently frozen. Like it doesn't get very much precipitation, but when it does, it immediately freezes and never, ever, ever disappears.
Okay.
Right? It's like if you go up into a true desert this way, like the closest true desert we have, this is not desert, this is chaparral, but it's hasn't rained in like 7 years, so it seems like a desert. But if you go up there, it only gets like 6 to 7 inches of rain a year, which is a really, really small amount of rain. But if you could immediately freeze all of that and it doesn't go anywhere, then after, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, man, you'd have a lot of ice. It'd be awesome. Be awesome. Sorry. Cycadophyta. What do you think? What do you think's in there? The cycads, right? And so here's a gymnosperm, large compound leaves. These aren't the needles of the Coniferaophyta. These are large, broad leaves. They look a little like palm trees. They aren't palm trees because palm trees are an angiosperm and these are a gymnosperm, right? So they look a little bit like palm trees, but what aren't they going to have? They're not going to make fruit. They're not going to make flowers, and any seeds they produce are going to be naked. And you'll see what that means when we actually look at some angiosperm seeds. Now, these had a really good run in the Mesozoic era, the middle part of our geological record. And so depending on how you describe the fossil record, either they had a really successful, really long run, or they were just really successful in a number of environments that don't exist anymore. And then, relatively unique among plants, separate sexes. And so, not that they produce different sized cones. That's very common for gymnosperms, that the male cones are small, the female cones are massive. But that the sexes are actually separate, that it's not a single individual producing both male and female cones, but that the male individual produces male cones, female individual produces female cones. It's unusual for plants, very unusual, but not for the Cycadophyta. So maybe another way you could tell them apart from palm trees is that they would have separate sexes. And they would have cones. That's a little strange. The Ginkgophyta. These have fan-shaped leaves, and this is a very lonely phylum made up of a single living species. Yeah, Allison.
About the cycad.
Yeah.
So is a pineapple a cycad?
No, a pineapple it grows on an angiosperm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but it grows on something that looks like a cycad. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question.
Would
Yeah.
you say the only surviving member?
Yeah, the fossil record is richer. Yeah, there are fossil forms in Ginkgophyta, for sure. Ginkgo biloba, the only surviving member. Oh my gosh, I totally forgot to go grab a black marker during your lecture break and copy back over this. That's so sad. If you can't read the orange, before you leave, come up and snap a little picture of that beauty. All right, and then the last one, Gametophyte. With a G, right? Like you see a silent G at the end of sign, but not at the beginning, man. That's awesome. Gametophyte. Now these, of all of our different types of gymnosperms, these are the most like angiosperms. They have big, broad leaves, very well-developed vessel systems, specifically in the xylem that transports water and nutrients.
So is this good evidence?
Well, so this would be the idea of if you are going to evolve angiosperms from gymnosperms, this would probably be the group where your original angiosperm came out of. And you could use it as evidence that it's like, yeah, this is really strong evidence. If we were going to go from like a fir tree, like what you put in your house at Christmas time, to an avocado tree, and you wanted to say what steps would we need to do along the process, you'd find some gymnosperms that would basically demonstrate that hypothetical organism that would exist. And you're like, oh man, it's not hypothetical anymore. It's like it actually exists. So here's a cycad. Looking at a little palm-like, except for we've got some cones, and they don't make fruit, right? They make naked seeds.
What does naked seeds look like?
I'll show you. Just wait for that one. All right, the next question. Oh, we've got time. You're worried that we won't have enough time? We've got 10 minutes left. We've got all the time in the world. And really, I mean, I could just keep talking, right? And most of you are going to be too polite to get up and leave, so I've got even more than 10 minutes. Why are angiosperms the dominant plants in most ecosystems? The overwhelming majority of plant diversity is inside of this group of angiosperms. Okay, it's more. It's incredible. Greater than 90% of all living species are angiosperms. And here's right from the text, why are they so successful? They're incredibly successful because they can be pollinated and transported without relying on water or wind. So remember, gymnosperms are also seed plants, and they do not have to rely on water, but they do have to rely on wind. And angiosperms have the ability to spread pollen, your male gametophyte, to where the female gametophytes are without relying on water or wind. Yeah. Anyways, some other information right out of the text. The embryo or young sporophyte can be nourished during times of environmental uncertainty. Because the seed is coated, it provides even better protection against drying out, being cold, or being unsafe, right? Because it's safe, moist, and warm. And the reason why angiosperms don't have to rely on water or wind is because they are primarily pollinated, where you actually carry the pollen, the male gametophyte, to where the female gametophyte is. They're primarily pollinated by animals, although wind still does a good job. And like I told you last time when I was talking about the strawberries in my backyard, sometimes it just false gravity actually works in this process. So flowers, these are modified leaves containing some structures that you were supposed to label in lab yesterday, or you will label in lab tomorrow if you have lab tomorrow. Sepals, petals, carpels, stamens. And so you're like, oh wow, that's so cool. Like, how do flowers facilitate animal pollination? And it's basically like a giant target saying, land here. Like, this is where your food is. So wonderful. It's like a sign saying there's a McDonald's at the next exit. Right? Land here. This is where your food is. Man, that's a frustrating thing about driving across the country is the only thing you can count on is McDonald's. Everything else, you're just like, man, I don't know if I can go another 17 hours without eating. But there's only McDonald's for the next 17 hours. Anyways, sorry. So you just get a bag of extra hot, flaming hot Cheetos. And you're like, I'll just survive on this. It's a great choice to make while driving. So the next one is fruit. Obviously come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes and flavors. Some of the fruit can be transported by wind. Well, that's kind of fun. Coconuts transported by water. Although most of the fruits are transported by animals. So not only does pollination happen primarily by animals, but even spreading the seeds out to somewhere else where they're not going to be choked for sunlight from their mom, that's also done by animals as well. Animals come and eat the fruit and then walk away and poop out the seeds. And those nice coated seeds help them to survive the digestive tract of an animal. So that you can find these little wild cat-like things that eat the cherries that the caffeine beans are in, and they eat the cherries and their digestive tract partially processes that seed, and then you brew coffee from it and sell it for an enormous amount of money because it's kind of hard to reproduce, right? Of like, you know, domesticating these animals to eat these coffee cherries and poop out the beans. Although there are people, in case you were worried, because you really like this idea, but you don't want to pay, you know, like $30, $40, $200 a pound for this coffee, there are groups that are actually feeding them to cattle, these cherries, and to other domesticated animals, and then, you know, processing those beans for coffee. Yeah. Field trip. I don't know if there's one even any close to here. I mean, maybe we should really, rather than a field trip, we should do this. I mean, we should do it. Let's get a couple of cattle, right? We can milk them, sell the cheese to the calf, and then feed them only the cherries with the coffee beans inside. Right? That's all we're gonna do is just feed them. I mean, that's all they eat. And then, of course, we have to feed them ground up brains from other cows so that we can study prions. Right. So here's an image from the text demonstrating the different varieties of flowers. Here are a couple of images from the text showing you life cycle and structures of the flowers, but many of you have already done this in lab yesterday. Some of you will do it in lab tomorrow. The benefit of doing angiosperms at the same time in lab and in lecture. Okay, it's good stuff. Take advantage of it because it won't often happen. Now we're in a situation where it's another framing question, but we do not have time to get all the way through this one, so we will end class here. It is 12:37. I owe you 2.5 minutes. Feel free to stick around. If you leave, I am not going to pay on that day. All right?